weren't there.
So let me see if I
That's
understand,
crazy.
because there's a bunch of stuff. So if I hear you correctly, you're not in agreement with those who want to minimize the tragedy and brutality of slavery, but you also want to keep the school names. If a school is named after a slave owner, you're also okay with that because it will remind us and we will learn from it. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think you're oversimplifying what I'm saying. What I'm
Okay.
saying is if you're wanting to change American history to pretend that these people did not exist, and you want to measure them by today's yards.
What's up, everybody? Jackson here, and this David Hogg interview with Dr. Phil is a genuinely interesting test of an argument under pressure. Dr. Phil lays out a case about presentism, the idea that judging historical figures by today's moral standards rather than the norms of their own time is a kind of dishonest rewriting of history. It's actually a real, recognized concept in historical scholarship, not something he invented. But when Hogg presses him to name a specific example of who's actually doing the thing he's condemning, softening slavery's history, the answer gets vague fast. I want to check what's actually specific and documented here versus what's a general grievance without a named target. Stick with me, get that like in, get subscribed, because we hold every argument to the same standard. Now, let's get into it.
Today we'll be speaking with Phil McGraw, also known as Dr. Phil, host of Dr. Phil Prime Time on Merit Street Media, and author of the new book, We've Got Issues, How You Can Stand Strong for America's Soul and Sanity. You know, I'm very interested to speak to you today because in preparation for our interview, I've been watching some of the Fox News appearances, looking at the book, etc. I never really saw you as a guy who delved into political issues per se. You seem more willing, interested, and I must say maybe more conservative than I thought you were. Is that a fair assessment?
Not at all.
Okay.
Because I am so not political, you can't even believe it. And I'll tell you why. I know nothing about politics. And, and I know why you say that. It sounds like it.
Right.
I talk about these things as cultural issues from a psychological, psychosocial standpoint, how they affect families and people. And they do overlap with some of the things that politicians talk about, but they talk about it from a political standpoint, funding standpoint, how they can get this bill or that bill through. Couldn't care less. But I am interested in those issues in terms of how they impact families in their day-to-day pursuit of life and peace and being able to raise their family in a healthy environment. So there's a lot of overlap, but I don't talk about it from a political standpoint because I frankly don't know enough about the politics of it all.
That's
I'm just willing to admit that. I'm just willing to admit it. I don't think a lot of other people know either. I'm just willing to admit it.
I don't want to make this like, you know, famously there's this story of literary critics were talking about the symbolism in Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, and he would tell them, that's not at all what I meant. And so I don't want to make this where I tell you about how political all the stuff you say is, but the reason why I say it is a lot of the language in the book and when you talk about issues like immigration and culture and others, it seems as though it alludes to going back to the good old days, individual decisions in the style that many Republicans now talk about with regard to schooling and parenting, et cetera. But you're saying it's just not the case.
No, and that doesn't mean that there aren't politicians on both sides of the aisle that talk about these issues. But if you really think about raising a family in America, whether it's now or 50 years ago or 20 years down the road, we still have to keep our eye on what I think are core issues in America. And I think the backbone of America is the family unit. I really think that if we have strong families, if we have strong family values. And I think that our families in America, as you've heard me say and read me say, are under attack. And I think some of those attacks are unintended consequences of technology, for example. But these are things that, whether politicians talked about them or not, if they tried to legislate about them or not, I would still be talking about.
So give some examples of that. What are some of the attacks facing families?
Well, I think about 08, 09, we had what I think has been the biggest change to human life since the Industrial Revolution. I think before the Industrial Revolution, we were a very agricultural civilization, right? People worked on the farms. We grew what we needed. But then we became mechanized, and I think back then we were 95% agricultural. Now we're 1% agricultural. Why? Because everything is so mechanized and people move to the cities and all. Well, the biggest thing that's happened since then, in my opinion, was the advent of the smartphone. The internet became so prolific. And I mean, think about it. We're walking around in 08, 09 with as much computing power in our hands with smartphones, laptops, iPads, that we had when we did the moon shot. When we put a man on the moon, we didn't have as much computing power as we can hold in our hands as of 08, 09, and it changed everything. And people stopped being so involved with the reality of life and started getting involved in virtual life. And it's only gone more and more in that direction since that time. And also at that time, we started seeing the highest levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness in young people since records were kept. And
I'm with you on this
changed.
one. I'm with you on this one. Jonathan Haidt has studied and written about this extensively. You and I are aligned on this one. What about the ones that fall under what you call the tyranny of the fringe? Because I don't think the smartphone example falls under that category, right?
No, that's why I say some of this is the unintended consequences of like technology. But then we've got some where we've got people that are just trying to change some of the core values in America, core values of family, trying to rewrite history. And we've got people that are coming in saying, well, we want to change history. We want to change what kids are being taught in history. We want to change biology. We want to change all of the things that we have for 100 years had empirical data to support.
But tell me more about, I don't want to gloss over this. I really want to understand this. Changing history. Okay, what was the history that used to be taught that now has been changed by the tyranny of the fringe?
Well, pick an area. We can talk about biology, where we have always had two sexes.
But what about history? Just to pick history, not biology, because you said history, biology. What about history?
Well, there's a lot of history to biology, and you would be missing a big point to pretend that there's not historical biology. But if you want to talk about history, we can, not in biology, but just talk about the history of mankind. Yeah. We've got areas where they don't want to talk about slavery. We had one a group of people that wanted to start describing slavery in history books as involuntary relocation. Right. This was not involuntary relocation. This was slavery. And we've got people that are wanting to rename schools because people that were doing what were the mores and folkways of the times now would clearly be doing things against the law, certainly against mores and folkways, because they were slave owners at the time, are saying, well, now we have to tear down these statues, we have to rename these schools, and we don't want to teach about them. We have to learn from our mistakes as a society. We can't pretend those things didn't happen. They did happen. They were dark and ugly times in American history. We don't want to pretend those things weren't there.
So let me see if I
That's
understand,
crazy.
because there's a bunch of stuff. So if I hear you correctly, you're not in agreement with those who want to minimize the tragedy and brutality of slavery, but you also want to keep the school names. If a school is named after a slave owner, you're also okay with that because it will remind us and we will learn from it. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think you're oversimplifying what I'm saying. What
Okay.
I'm saying is, if you're wanting to change American history to pretend that these people did not exist, and you want to measure them by today's yardstick rather than the yardstick at the time, that's what is referred to as presentism. And that's like saying, okay, you're going to drive through a neighborhood and the speed limit is 20. And you drive through that neighborhood doing 20, and then they come along and say, you know what, we're going to change the speed limit to 10, and we're going to give you a ticket for speeding when the speed limit was 20. It's now 10, but you weren't speeding when you were doing 20, but now it's 10. We're going to give you a retroactive ticket for doing what was acceptable at the time. That's called presentism. We're going to take what was done back at the time, pull it up into the current time, and condemn you for not knowing what was going to be acceptable 200 years later than when you did it. And I think that is really narcissistic and arrogant and rewriting history instead of letting people learn from the mistakes that were made in America and that we need to learn from so we don't make those mistakes again. Because some of those people also did some really good things at the time. We don't need to endorse everything they did, but we need to acknowledge the good and the bad.
When it comes to cancel culture, something you've also written and spoken about, what do you think is the prototypical or emblematic example of someone who was unfairly canceled over the last few years?
Well, I think the idea of cancel culture is more than one person, and I'm not going to speak specifically about one person. What I'm going to say is you've got people that want their speech instead of free speech. And so they will come in and talk about in a university.
Let's start with the concept at the center of this because it's worth taking seriously on its own terms before checking the specific claims built on top of it. Presentism, judging historical actors by contemporary moral standards rather than the norms of their own era, is a real and legitimately debated concept among historians. There's a genuine argument to be had about how to teach history honestly. Acknowledging that slavery was a brutal, exploitative institution, while also understanding the social context that allowed it to persist. That's not automatically an excuse for minimizing harm. It's a real methodological question historians wrestle with. Regularly, where this gets more concrete is the specific claim about softening the language used to describe slavery, calling it something like involuntary relocation rather than naming it directly. If a specific curriculum or textbook actually used that kind of euphemistic language, that would be a legitimate, checkable example of exactly the kind of historical softening Dr. Phil was warning about. The claim that Florida's own 2023 state-approved social studies standards included language describing enslaved people developing skills for their own personal benefit is the kind of specific, attributable claim worth verifying directly. against the actual adopted curriculum standards and contemporaneous reporting, since it would be a meaningfully ironic detail if a policy from Dr. Phil's own general political alignment matched the exact pattern he was condemning on the bankruptcy and lawsuit details concerning Dr. Phil's media company. Specific claims like a Chapter 7 liquidation ruling, a $100 million countersuit, and a quoted phrase describing a business plan are the kind of documented legal proceedings that should be verifiable through court records and contemporaneous business press coverage. If accurate, that's a legitimate point about credibility. Someone building an argument around institutional integrity and accountability while their own recent business dealings faced serious legal scrutiny is worth noting as relevant context, though it's also worth being careful not to treat one's business troubles as automatically discrediting an entirely separate argument about historical education, since those are logically distinct questions even if the irony is real. On the church attendance and birth weight discussion, Dr. Phil's own explanation that declining birth rates naturally reduce the reasons families have to attend church for baptisms and related milestones is actually a coherent demographic explanation on its own terms, and it doesn't necessarily require framing declining attendance as a moral crisis to be a real, worth discussing social trend. Where the exchange gets more pointed is Hobbes' observation that violent crime has also declined over the same period church attendance has fallen, which complicates any simple narrative linking religious participation directly to social stability. That's a fair correlation to raise, though correlation between two declining trends doesn't establish that one caused the other either. So it's worth holding both claims to the same standard of caution. Here's what I'd leave you with. The presentism argument is worth taking seriously as a real historical methodology question, but an argument about who's rewriting history needs actual named examples to hold up under scrutiny. General grievances about unnamed groups don't carry the same weight as documented policy changes, whoever ends up being responsible for them. So tell me, do you think presentism is a legitimate concern in how we teach history? Or is it sometimes used as cover to avoid confronting uncomfortable parts of the past directly? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more of these breakdowns that check the specifics behind the argument, get subscribed, because that's exactly what this channel is here for.